June 3rd, 1944. A cold, salt-whipped morning off the south coast of England, the sea like hammered pewter. Nicholas Straussler stands on the deck of a landing ship, collar turned up against wind that tastes of iron and seaweed. He is slight, coat buttoned tight, a cigarette pinned between two thin fingers, though he rarely smokes when work awaits. Around him, the ship is a theatre of industry. Winches groan, sailors shout over the chafing of cable and steel, and the smell of hot oil and diesel hangs everywhere. Straussler watches the line of tanks below, M4 Shermans, bulky and aloof in their olive drab, and thinks in angles and buoyancy, in the stubborn geometry of steel and water. To most men, a tank is a machine of land. To Straussler, whose hands have spent a lifetime coaxing odd machines into impossible roles, a tank is a problem to be solved. He had not come to the Admiralty as a showman. He had come with paper, with sketches that looked like stagecraft. A fabric collar, a folded screen, a way to put a floating skirt around a tank and let the sea carry it ashore. The collar would lock into place. A canvas screen would rise around the hull like the sides of a boat. A lightweight propeller and a power takeoff would give thrust. The tracks would steer, and the engine would grunt a rhythm familiar to any tank crew. It was elegant in its simplicity and ridiculous in its appearance. Men in polished boots called it the bathtub idea. Generals laughed. Admirals shook their heads. Tanks swim? They asked each other in tones that implied the whole venture was a misguided sailor's dream. Straussler did not laugh. He had fled continental Europe once already, carrying nothing but his name and a stubborn habit of solving problems. He had watched armored vehicles shed mud and climb curbs in peacetime. He had imagined them riding waves. He remembered the look on a commander's face when the first test prototype, a wheeled tractor with a canvas skirt, rose from the water and nosed toward the beach, as if it had finally found its native element. That commander had not laughed. He had been too busy reaching for the radio to tell someone else to look. Now it was the eve of the invasion, and the stakes were so enormous that even the ludicrous could be reconsidered. Straussler walks the line of crews, speaking in a quick, technical voice, pointing at valves, spool clamps, the canvas seam stitched with six-fold thread. He insists the skirt be tied with rope in a certain way, that the propeller shaft be cleaned and greased, that the engine be warmed to a specific temperature before the screen is raised. He talks about ballast, about air pockets and how a tank's sheer weight, its friend on mortar fields and bridges, becomes its enemy in a sea that will pitch and roll. Officers lean in, half to humor him, half because they have to, and Straussler explains the hand signals crews must use, the order of operations the men will perform with gloved hands when all the clocks are counting down. Testing had been brutal and small and secreted away at isolated beaches and shallow bays. Tanks had bobbed and rolled, the canvas flapping like a man's wild coat in a gale. There were failures. Skirts tore, prop shafts snapped, crews were drenched and cold and terrified. There were near-tragic mishaps in which design met a stern, indifferent sea and lost. Each failure taught Straussler something that the general's memos did not. Each small triumph fed him with a belief that was no longer theoretical, but earned in salt and sweat. The conversion rigs became clever. Collapsible floats folded around the hull, pumps to keep the skirts taut, little cowlings for propellers that would be retracted once the tank hit the sand. Engineers who had mocked the first sketches began to sit close and ask questions about seam strength, about the best way to seal a turret hatch to keep seawater from the gun breech, and still ridicule lingered. In staff rooms and over maps, men in uniforms with too many stripes called Straussler's proposals a gamble with armored doctrine. "A tank is heavy," a brigadier had said once, tapping a finger on a pile of intelligence reports. Heavy, things sink. The fact that the idea required men to leave the safety of the transport and push an armoured vehicle off a ramp into a grey sea felt, to many, like asking a lorry to sprout wings. Straussler did not respond to ridicule with speeches. He responded with another test, another revision, another sleepless night counting seams and rivets. In those final days before the operation they called Overlord, the air hummed with readiness and the thin, brittle noise of disbelief. Straussler's tank, christened in foul humour by some as the canvas cruiser, was loaded onto LCTs beside other craft. Crews practiced the sequence until their hands moved like the music of work, bolt, clamp, raise, lock. In the dim light of dawn, some men whispered that it would be a spectacle at best, a funeral pyre at worst. Others, the men who had seen the flotation tests, the petty officers who had watched a Sherman ride on a swell and track toward shore without sinking, kept quiet because they had seen what had been sewed and welded into the skirts. Then, there was the night before the crossing, when Straussler walked to the vessel's rail alone. The sea was a low organ of sound. The sky was a blur of cloud. He held his cap to his chest against the wind and thought about the men who would ride inside the tanks, about the crews who would trust the seams of canvas more than they trusted the doctrine of generals. He thought about the irony that a man with a name foreigners found hard to place might change the face of a battle planned by men with titles like stamped authority. He lit another cigarette, though he had every reason to be too anxious to do so, and watched the dark water. The next morning would demand everything: courage, machinery, and a fabric sewn in a small workshop to do a very large, violent thing. June 6, 1944. The English Channel roared like a living thing. Just after 5 a.m., the horizon was already trembling under the weight of the largest invasion fleet the world had ever seen. Over 5,000 vessels, a grey armada stretching from edge to edge, their wakes carving white scars through the dark water. The men aboard could smell the oil, the salt, the cordite beginning to mix in the wind. And below decks, in the bowels of the landing craft tank vessels, Nicholas Straussler's floating Shermans waited, their canvas screens folded tight against the hulls, their crews strapped in, engines rumbling low and impatient. The order came down in clipped voices through the intercoms: "Prepare to launch." On board LCT 610, Sergeant Alan Pritchard checked the pressure gauge, sweat glistening across his forehead despite the cold. "You sure this bloody thing floats?" a gunner muttered. Pritchard didn't answer. He had trained enough to know that hesitation could drown a man faster than seawater. He pulled the canvas release lever, and with a hydraulic hiss, the waterproof skirt unfolded upward like a blooming flower. The men heard the faint pop of fabric stretching against steel rings and the clatter of locking bars snapping into place. Straussler stood a few decks above, watching the first tank ease toward the ramp. The sea was angrier than he'd hoped, wind pushing at 20 knots, waves breaking high and heavy. "They won't hold in this," an officer behind him muttered. Straussler didn't respond. His eyes followed the lead Sherman as it crept to the edge. A moment of hesitation, a pause that seemed to last forever, and then the driver gunned the throttle. With a spray of white foam, the tank rolled off the ramp and vanished beneath the waves. Gasps rose from every deck. The water swallowed the vehicle completely. 5 seconds, 6, 7. Then miraculously the canvas skirt bobbed back to the surface. The tank floated. The propellers began to churn. The turret hatch opened, and the commander inside waved a brief, almost disbelieving hand signal. Straussler exhaled, a small, unsteady laugh breaking through the sound of the sea. Within minutes, dozens of other duplex drive tanks followed suit, plunging into the water in synchronized rhythm. Iron machines turned fragile boats, each carrying 5 men who trusted in little more than cloth, hope, and engineering. Their propellers whirred, cutting the channel like fishtails, steering toward the pale line of sand that marked Normandy. It wasn't perfect. Some tanks went down almost immediately, swallowed whole by the rough swell. Off Omaha Beach, many never resurfaced, victims of wind, waves, and fate. But off Sword, Juno, and Gold Beaches, the sight was like something out of myth. Tanks, floating, moving, firing, appeared out of the grey surf, canvas skirts glistening with seawater as they churned toward the German defences. German soldiers on the cliffs above froze in disbelief. Through binoculars, officers saw what looked like boats carrying cannons, until they realized the boats were tanks. Panzer crews scrambled to reposition, gunners blinked through smoke and rain, and by the time the first shells from the DD tanks struck, confusion had already sown chaos among the defenders. On the sand, infantry who had feared walking into unbroken machine gun fire suddenly saw armoured silhouettes rising from the surf beside them. Green giants spitting flame and smoke. Cheers erupted even as bullets snapped overhead. Men pointed, laughing through exhaustion and fear. "They bloody float!" someone shouted. Straussler, still aboard the ship, felt none of it firsthand. He was pacing the deck, counting seconds, calculating survival rates in his head. His invention, once mocked as folly, was now crawling onto occupied soil, metal treads cutting through water and sand. He would later hear reports that in sectors where the tanks made it ashore, beach casualties had been cut in half. But at that moment, none of it mattered. He stood at the rail, eyes stinging from salt spray, watching a horizon alive with smoke and thunder. The invasion had begun. And his strange, stitched idea, a machine born from ridicule, was leading the charge. By noon, the beaches of Normandy were an orchestra of chaos, waves breaking red, smoke drifting low across the dunes, and the air filled with the metallic rattle of small arms fire. The DD tanks that survived the crossing were scattered across the sand, some half submerged, others grinding inland with the rhythm of something both mechanical and alive. At Sword Beach, a single tank, water still dripping from its canvas skirt, lurched forward to blast a German pillbox that had pinned down a company of British infantry for nearly an hour. The gunner's first shell tore through the concrete, sending debris and men tumbling in every direction. The infantry, who had been crawling through shallow water, stood for the first time all morning. They began to move again, following the lumbering shadow that cleared their path. Reports of floating tanks spread through the Allied ranks faster than any command order. Men shouted it to each other as if sharing a miracle. "They're real, they're working," one lieutenant yelled over the roar of the surf. To men who had been told to expect near-suicidal odds, the sight of a tank rising out of the sea felt like divine intervention, as if the impossible had decided to take their side. In London, news arrived hours later through encrypted radio. Dispatches. Officers in polished boots gathered around a teletype machine, scanning the first reports from the front. Duplex drive tanks effective, multiple beachheads secured, success higher than projected. The same generals who had mocked Straussler's designs now stood in stunned silence. One of them, a man who had once told Straussler to leave the sea to sailors, stared at the message, then muttered, "I'll be damned." Meanwhile, aboard a landing ship anchored miles offshore, Straussler sat alone in the mess hall, a cold mug of tea in front of him. He could hear the distant rumble of naval guns, a sound like rolling thunder. An officer entered, his uniform dusted with salt, and handed him a slip of paper. "Message from Sword Sector, sir," he said. Straussler took it, unfolded it carefully. It read, "Tanks ashore, working perfectly. Thank you, sir." He folded the paper once, twice, and slipped it into his coat pocket without speaking. His eyes glistened, but whether from pride or exhaustion, no one could tell. In the following days, as the Allies secured their foothold in France, the legend of the swimming tanks grew. Combat photographers captured haunting images of Shermans crawling up the beaches, their canvas skirts shredded and dripping. Newspapers back home ran the photos beneath headlines like "Floating Armor Breaks Nazi Defenses." Straussler, however, avoided the limelight. He spent those days knee-deep in reports and field notes, already sketching improvements. His mind, trained to engineer rather than bask in glory, saw flaws, the need for better skirt material, stronger pumps, improved propeller housings. Perfection, he once told an assistant, is not when nothing can be added, but when nothing can fail. When word of his success reached the War Office, invitations followed, interviews, commendations, even the possibility of knighthood. He accepted none of it immediately. "They laughed once," he said quietly to a fellow engineer, "and that was fair. They had reason to. What matters is they don't laugh now, and that the boys came home." By late June, the beaches of Normandy were secure. The invasion had succeeded. But in the machinery of history, amid the grand names of generals and the tide of battle reports, the quiet figure of Nicholas Straussler remained in the background. Few of the men who stormed the beaches ever knew his name. Yet every survivor who crawled behind a Sherman that day had been sheltered by his stubborn belief in the absurd, and perhaps that was enough. The war had been changed not by brute force alone, but by an idea once dismissed as foolish, a machine that could float, an invention born of ridicule and persistence. Straussler would later visit Normandy in person, standing beside one of his DD tanks, now rusting quietly in the dunes. The canvas was torn, the paint chipped, the propellers frozen in place. He placed a hand on its side, the metal cool under the grey French sky, and whispered something that only the sea could hear. Then, without ceremony, he turned back toward the car, waiting to take him home. London, 1946. The war was over. The medals had been handed out, and the factories that once roared for war now hummed with the quiet industry of peace. Nicholas Straussler sat in his small workshop off Oxford Street, surrounded by blueprints and rusted prototypes, relics of a world that had tried to destroy itself, and, in doing so, forced men like him to dream beyond reason. On the workbench before him sat a small model tank, the first DD prototype he'd built in 1940, its canvas skirt now stiff and yellowed with age. It looked almost laughable in the soft morning light, like a child's toy pretending to be a weapon. Yet Straussler stared at it the way a soldier might look at an old photograph, with a mix of pride, grief, and disbelief that it had ever existed at all. Outside, life had moved on. Children played in bombed-out streets. Soldiers returned home to families who barely recognized them. The papers called it a new dawn, but Straussler knew better. Wars didn't end. They just changed shape. Visitors still came by occasionally, military historians, engineers, journalists, all eager to meet the man who had made tanks swim. He was polite but distant, his mind always elsewhere. When one young reporter asked him what it felt like to have changed the course of D-Day, Straussler smiled faintly and said, "I didn't change it. The men who believed enough to climb into those floating coffins did." He never spoke of the laughter in the War Office halls, or the way officers had smirked when he'd unveiled his first amphibious model, but those who knew him best could tell that memory never left him. His invention had worked, yes, but only after years of being told it couldn't, and that, perhaps, was the truest battle he'd ever fought. In the years that followed, armies around the world adopted amphibious armor as a standard of warfare. From the Rhine crossings to the Korean peninsula, tanks rode the water like steel whales, not miracles anymore, but expected tools of strategy. The world had caught up with the man it once mocked. Yet Straussler remained a ghost in his own legend. He never patented fame, only function. His mind turned instead to civilian designs, flood-resistant vehicles, portable bridges, machines meant to rebuild rather than destroy. "If we can make war machines swim," he told a colleague in 1948, "then maybe we can make peace float, too." In his final years, he kept a single photograph framed above his desk, a black-and-white image taken on June 6, 1944. It showed a Sherman DD tank emerging from the surf at Normandy, its skirt torn, its crew standing atop it waving. To troops on the beach, scrawled in his handwriting on the back were just 3 words: "They believed anyway." When he died in 1966, few headlines marked his passing. His name appeared in the margins of history books, nestled between statistics and footnotes about amphibious operations. But among soldiers, engineers, and the few who understood what it meant to fight ridicule with imagination, Nicholas Straussler was remembered not as an inventor, but as a believer. Because sometimes the war is not against an enemy, but against disbelief itself. And in that quiet, stubborn war, he won.